I'm seeing an increasing sense, at least in the groups that I hang out with, of all ages, of all races, a return of common sense, a return to the idea that society isn't responsible for your outcome, that you're responsible for your outcome, and that society's outcome is a function of hundreds of millions of people taking control of their own outcomes.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and this is the Miles Franklin Weekly Special for August 28th through September 4th, 2023, while supplies last. This week we feature your choice 1-ounce silver rounds at just $2.50 over spot. Choose between the Silver Buffalo or Silver Asahi rounds, both at $2.50 over spot, both 22 a tube, and both 500 to a box. The Silver Buffalo is made by various private mints across the U.S., with a design based on James Earl Fraser's iconic Buffalo nickel. These 3/9 fine rounds are highly recognizable and one of the most trusted types of bullion rounds available. Next, the Asahi refinery continues the legacy of famed private mint Johnson Matthey, which they purchased in 2015 and refined with the same attention to detail, cementing their status as an LBMA certified supplier. Their 1-ounce rounds are also 3/9 fine and also on sale for just $2.50 over spot. Additionally, the Asahi rounds are IRA eligible. If you'd like to learn more about a precious metals IRA, call us, and we'll be happy to help you in that process. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. This is your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. We're always glad to have this widely followed returning guest. Rick Rule, formerly the CEO of Sprott Asset Management and currently the CEO of Rule Investment Media, joins us this Thursday, August 31st, 2023. Rick, thanks for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Dunnigan, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
This is our second interview following the Rule Symposium on Natural Resources Investing that we both attended last month in Boca Raton. And it was eye-opening for all those present. I talked with many people who said that they heard things they hadn't heard before, or it was good to hear them from a different angle than they had heard before. And even people who came up and said, I thought I had all the dots, but there was one more dot. This connects all the dots for me. So it was a lot of value taken by those in attendance. Grateful for that opportunity to be there among so many well-informed and well-connected people like yourself and all the exhibitors, all the speakers, all the attendees. And we asked you before what one of your key takeaways was from the conference. You shared a few of them. Wonder if you've had any further high-level observations that you think would be of value to people who perhaps weren't able to attend, but would maybe whet their appetite for making sure that they sign up next time, that has emerged for you in retrospect on the conference.
I think there's probably two things that we haven't talked about yet, Dunnigan. One is to reemphasize Pareto's law, which is to suggest in most fields of human activity, most of the positive utility is caused by a very small group of people. This is the sort of social science dictum of the 80-20 rule, where it's alleged that 20% of a population base does 80% of the work. It turns out to be, roughly speaking, true across a variety of disciplines. What we tried to point out at the conference, and what I think people need to pay attention to, is two things. This is a bell-shaped curve, which suggests that 20% of the population engaged in any particular task generate 80% of the positive utility. A very different 20% of the population contribute 80% of what we will call the disutility, or the aggravation. The second thing to know about Pareto's law is that if you run the same good 20% lip or bad 20% lip through the same performance dispersal curve, the curves conformably align, which in English means that 20% of the 20 do 80% of the 80, or 4% of the population engaged in any specific task generates mid 60% of the utility, and a different one contributes mid 60% of the disutility. It turns out, Dunnigan, that in a population base as large as mining or oil and gas, that performance dispersal curve populates similarly one more time, which is to suggest that 1% or less than 1% of the population base engaged in any activity generates in excess of 40% of the positive utility. A corroboration of this in very rough form, I'm not sure it's positive utility, is that less than 1% of U.S. taxpayers pay 42% of the income and capital gains tax. I'm not sure that constitutes positive utility, but it is statistical confirmation of the assertion that Pareto's law conformably aligns up to at least 3 standard deviations. So what does this mean for your account? What it means is that in terms of selecting particularly speculative investments, that you stick with people who are serially successful, people who have experienced success in the past, and success that's specifically related to the task at hand. The most popular feature of the Rule Symposiums, going back almost 30 years, is something called the living legends. The living legends are entrepreneurs who have been serially successful, building more than one multi-billion-dollar public company in extractive industries from standing starts. I think a very important takeaway from this conference and from the whole series of conferences, as well as our investor bootcamp, is that so much utility is generated by 1% of the population base that statistically going outside that 1% cohort greatly increases your risk and greatly decreases your rewards. So that's the first thing I would talk about. The second thing that I think I failed to talk about in our last discussion is the importance of optimism. It's difficult, when you look at the circumstances that surround us, social strife, government, taxation, war, debt. It's tough to remain positive. But you have to remain positive. The fact is that if you're frozen into inactivity, you guarantee yourself a loss. I can't tell you in how many circumstances I've been told by investors or by people who are entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs or people who are trying to become more materially successful. I just can't make this work. It's Trudeau or it's Obama or it's Biden or something like that. Biden doesn't even know that you exist. So using people, leaders, or using circumstance as an excuse to fail is a guarantee of failure. Despite the challenges that are in front of us, we need to remain optimistic. When I talk to all the living legends, when I talk to Robert Friedland, when I talk to the Lundin family, when I talk to Bob Quartermain, when I talk to all of those people, what I see is a circumstance where despite the obstacles in front of them, or perhaps because of the obstacles in front of them, they succeed. So I think it's very, very, very important to see the impediments in front of us as impediments that we can overcome, but impediments that cause other people who are perhaps as competent as we are not to try as hard, giving us better competitive advantage. I think those are 2 very important takeaways.
It was enlightening to me when you started on the Pareto Principle, and for those who aren't familiar with him, Italian statistician that broke this open in the field of business, but it turns out it applies to all kinds of, in nature, in all fields of endeavor, that sort of thing. It's remarkable how broadly his principles apply, and it reminded me of the second one you mentioned about positivity. Even in early childhood family education, my wife and I have 5 children, soon to be 13 grandchildren, but the principle of describe what you want and not what you don't want. So many times we fall into the pit of saying, stop running, stop hurting your brother, or you're going to break that, or whatever, rather than describing what the outcome is you desire. And a widely followed teacher of this, Lou Tice from the Pacific Institute, says, what is it going to look like when we don't have the problem? And it echoes back into the arena of preparedness that I'm familiar with since December 2013 when I started Reluctant Preppers. We've been focusing on clear and present dangers, clear and present dangers, clear and present dangers, and it can get to seem quite depressing or overwhelming or hopeless or that sort of thing. But my wife keeps reminding me, what's it going to look like when we don't have the problem? So that redirects all of our creative energies from just describing the problem, which we can call awareness, into action, which we can call preparedness. So I really appreciate that, and have experienced the veracity of that in other fields of life as well. I think that people who are listening to this can confirm in their own lives that it's much more productive to focus on what are we going to do about it, rather than whose fault is it, what went wrong, and just keep digging down that hole.
Well, yours was a very succinct summary, so thank you.
I'm not sure that was succinct, but anyway, wanting to ask you further, because many people are watching, for example, and you spoke with us last time we had you on about the accumulation of sort of critical mass among the BRICS Plus nations, where there seems to be a coalition recognizing the importance of real things, commodities, perhaps precious metals. Can you talk to us, because this in many ways echoes a principle that you've brought to us as you're looking for that needle in the haystack, which gets back to your Pareto Principle. You're looking for companies that are not only serially successful, but those who have real assets, who are actually finding real things and not just saying, we're out on a hunt. We'll always be out on a hunt because we like the lifestyle. But anyway, what are your thoughts as someone who has spent a career looking for real value in real things about that principle? Is it in fact the driving principle, or a driving principle behind this coalition of the BRICS nations looking for real things?
Well, my suspicion is that the coalition of the BRICS nations is not so much about real things as their opposition to the attempt by the U.S. government to oppose U.S. hegemony on the rest of the world, impose America's values, oppose America's interests, and also, frankly, as a function of the fact that the arithmetic around U.S. Treasury securities is no longer good. I also think, in relation to your question, that we are entering an epoch where real things increase more rapidly in value than other things did. As a consequence, I think, of an underinvestment in natural resources in favor of other things, including consumer products, in the last 40 years. I note that in my lifetime, the market share of food in a household budget has fallen by 30% of a household budget to 15%, which is to say, from a historical point of view, food and agricultural products are very, very, very cheap. I think they're going to become less cheap. The composite cost of commodities in various consumer products, cell phones, cars, computers, is very, very low. The value add has come from technology. Through overinvesting in technology and underinvesting in natural resources, we have created artificially, in fact, the circumstance that will come to lead to resource scarcity 5 years, 6 years, 7 years from now. And because the cost associated with things like the copper in your cell phone or the platinum in your catalytic converter is so low, the price must go up because of scarcity, and it can go up. Let's look and I'm not saying to buy platinum, but let's look at platinum. It costs $125 worth of platinum to make a catalytic converter work to enable the sale of a $50,000 or $60,000 car. If the price of platinum were to double, and it costs $250 as opposed to $125 to sell a $50,000 car, it wouldn't make any impact on the demand for the car. So I think those two circumstances, the weaponization of the US dollar and the forced conversion really of other nations to their own, at least, settlement mechanism, and the repricing of extractive industry commodities relative to other products in the world, means that the next 10 years will be better than the last 40 years have been for investments in natural resources.
That gets back to why it's, as you've talked to us about being a contrarian, is positioning yourself before most recognize the value that you've recognized in advance, and then having the fortitude to hang in there while you said you have to wait a while. You have to be wrong. You have to be willing to be wrong for a while before you get to be proven right. If you wait to be proven right, you've missed most of the opportunity.
You know, Duncan, I think if you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, many of which have not been kind to natural resource investing, what you will see is 3 or 4 cyclical rebounds in various facets of natural resource investing. It might be copper, it might be oil, it might be something else. My suspicion is in sometime in the next 10 years, we head into a secular bull market, which is very different than a cyclical bull market. I don't know that this secular bull market that I'm talking about will be as dramatic as the bull market that we enjoyed in the decade of the 1970s. But I suspect it could easily be as dramatic as the secular bull market that we enjoyed, if you could call it a secular bull market. It might have been a cyclical bull market in the period 2000 to, depending on your point of view, 2008 or 2011. It's important when we look at that bull market as compared to the earlier bull market to remember that while less dramatic, it was still pretty dramatic. The gold price increased from $250 an ounce to what, $1,800 an ounce? The oil price advanced from $12 a barrel, if my memory serves me correctly, to $120 a barrel. The uranium price advanced from $8 a pound to $150, $160 a pound. I'm not saying that you're going to get those types of price increases going forward, although it wouldn't surprise me if we did. What I am trying to say is that the undervaluation, the historic undervaluation of natural resource economies relative to other asset classes in the economy is going to shift. It's going to shift for 2 reasons. Population growth, and a wonderful reason, the increasing material of living standards enjoyed by the poorest third of humanity. We've talked about this before, Donegan. But people all around the world want to live like you and I, and we live materially very dense lives. As we increase the living standards of the poorest of the poor, which we've done a wonderful job of for the last 50 years, those people demand more material goods. In the face of this increasing demand, we have a circumstance where humankind has underinvested in supply for about 30 years. This is basic economics. When increased demand runs into reduced supplies, you have increased prices. And you have increased prices in capital-intensive cyclical industries where it takes years of reinvestment to increase supply. Now, will this blessed event occur? Blessed depending on who you are, an investor, blessed, a consumer, occurs. Will this blessed event occur in 2024, 2025? I don't know. It could certainly be interrupted by a recession. You can have falling supplies if you have falling demand and you don't have an increase in price. What I've learned about downturns, what I've learned about recessions is that they end and markets don't end. Supply and demand doesn't end. If you remember that bull market 2000 to 2010, I would suggest to you that it was partly due to underinvestment in resources in the 1990s and partly due to the ascendance of China, partly due to the urbanization of 450 million desperately poor rural Chinese into an urban middle class or lower middle class lifestyle. We are seeing that emergence occur in Indonesia. We're seeing it occur in India. We're seeing it occur in Brazil. Maybe not to the same explosive extent that we saw it occur in China, but remember, it's ongoing in China too. So I really feel like in many ways, the next 10 years is going to be different, perhaps radically different than the last 40. Not in every circumstance better, because the last 40 years has been pretty benign. You know, peace, global trade, specialization, declining real interest rates. Despite whatever difficulties we've had in the last 40 years, it will probably go down as the most benign 40 years in human history.
I wanted to, before we leave the topic entirely of the East versus West, kind of playing off a different playbook, it appears on the surface that, for example, China seems to be using a different playbook than the U.S. You mentioned countries all over the world getting burned by sanctions imposed by the U.S. and that sort of thing. There's an interesting article, I hadn't mentioned to it before, but I'm going to mention it just for the benefit of our viewers. It came out from Victor Davis Hanson, Imperialism Lessons from History. You can find that at where is he? Hillsdale. So hillsdale.edu. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about that, Rick, was because you have also, in conjunction with your investing seminars, have also had ones on ethics. And what are your thoughts about the apparently different playbook that China is using to go into countries all over the world and help them build up infrastructure. I'll let you rattle off because you know more about it than I do. What they're doing in these countries, I have some clue, but it seems to be quite different from going in and saying, we're the U.S., we have a bigger army and navy, and you're going to do what we tell you to, or else. Do you see a major ethical difference in the means or the implied outcomes that China is seeking versus the way the U.S. has managed their international relations?
I would look to the U.S. government or the Chinese government for any lessons in ethics. I think that you need to describe them as strategies. I think that the Chinese strategy is the same as the American strategy was in the 1950s and 1960s. We didn't involve ourselves in the internal affairs of other countries unless they were antithetical to U.S. interests. And we were very active at that point in time in focusing whatever aid the United States gave on infrastructure and investments that increased the U.S. influence and access in those countries. We were perfectly fond in the United States of supporting despots around the world if those despots acted in the U.S. interest, either economically or in a sort of an anti-Soviet sphere, which is precisely the pragmatic approach to the Chinese today. What the Chinese have said to any kind of government is what you're doing internally is your own affair. We will help you develop it, that's if you want, or we'll flatter the elites in the legislature. Look at the Chinese spending $80 million to build a new parliament building in Zimbabwe rather than aiding starving Zimbabweans. Now, we have nothing to teach the Chinese with regards to ethics. We supported the Mobutu government. We supported the Saudis. We don't have a track record with any particular sterling success with regards to how would you say, a charitable activity towards the rest of the world. But what we have begun to do is attempt to enforce America's social values on other societies. The societies don't have any particular interest in them, and also don't want to be lectured by a country that has as many social ills as the United States. Both the Chinese and the Russians are substantially more pragmatic. They're much like the Americans were in the 1950s and 1960s. We taught them the playbook. They picked it up, and we've discarded it. Similarly, the Russian method of adding value for political elites in Africa is very simple. We will send you very reliable and, by the way, very tough internal Russian security that doesn't care too much about ethnicity or clan or tribal values. We will support the powers in place against domestic coups if you adhere to policies that benefit the Russians. This is precisely what the United States did in the 1950s and 1960s. Nothing new. It's just we've abandoned that technique, and I'm not defending it necessarily. And more pragmatic countries that needed access to the supply chains that the United States has already enjoyed has begun to employ those tactics. I wouldn't describe them as ethics because I don't believe that governments are, by and large, ethical.
We've had guests on recently who have talked to us about the same pressure being brought to bear. You said in the interests of, like, when it was the U.S. national interest, and you described Russian national interest, Chinese national interest. We've heard that there's significant pressure being brought to bear by those in control of streams of capital, whether it's BlackRock or their ilk, or the globalists arranged by Klaus Schwab and the WEF and so on, saying to corporations, for example, you will not have access to capital unless you abide by because you mentioned pressuring on social issues and that sort of thing. The S in social is the S in ESG. So we are watching people are watching with hope that some of the environmental goals that are maybe valid aren't being drowned out by those that are perhaps spurious and so on. From an investor standpoint, do you as an investor, see the kinds of pressures being brought upon corporations that maybe have nothing to do with the good of the shareholders, just like these pressures brought on countries that have nothing to do with the good of their people?
I absolutely positively do. I think we live in a world where there's an extraordinary disconnect between an individual and the expression of that individual's will and the application of that individual's will. Many people around the world, not just Americans, have consigned their financial futures to the BlackRocks of the world because perhaps they feel uneducated or perhaps they're lazy. The consequence of that is that BlackRock enjoys, if that's the right phrase, but has the responsibility for $9 trillion in assets. It's not BlackRock's money. It's your money. It's my money. But we have empowered them to make decisions around the application of our capital. At the same time that that's happened, another actor that has even less connection to the money, the government, is making things easy or difficult for BlackRock. And I would suspect, although I don't know, that the value orientation, or pardon me, the values orientation, the ethics, if they exist, among the senior executives at BlackRock and the senior executives on K Street are probably fairly similar. The consequence of that is that investment decisions are being made in terms of the application of your capital by people who are two times removed from you. I think that's problematic. For me personally, it's useful, not in a political or social sphere, but rather because it's very easy for me, managing my own money and money of people who are very close to me, to outperform BlackRock, because BlackRock is constrained by their own ethos. It's as though I'm in the ring fighting against a younger, tougher Mike Tyson, except for Mike Tyson has voluntarily strapped his ankles together and has voluntarily strapped his wrists together. He's trying to compete with me, although he's a better, smarter, tougher competitor, but he's immobile. And this whole sort of ethos around the part of ESG, which is fiction, has hobbled a lot of investors, and in particular, hobbled people who have consigned their capital first to BlackRock and secondly to the US government, to their detriment and frankly to my own benefit. Now, there is a broad-ranging discussion around ESG, and I'm delighted that it's occurring. I've attempted to participate in it from my own small point of view. What we're seeing around the world is that countries that feel that they can't afford, or societies, pardon me, that feel they can't afford to be hobbled by the preferences of the big thinkers are saying, no. Let's look at a couple examples. One would be carbon. The big thinkers in the world would prefer, because of American politics and German politics and British politics, to distribute the burden of carbon neutrality around the world in fairly stilted fashion. They're assigning carbon liability by carbon generation, by nation, worldwide, which is to say India has the same obligations, as an example, as the United States. People in India point out something very different. They say that the carbon obligation and the carbon credit should occur on a per capita basis. Since there's 1.4 billion Indians and 330 million Americans, they think that a measurement of carbon generation should be done per capita rather than per nation. It's very difficult to argue the arithmetic behind that. Further, the Indians would argue that carbon, if it's a concern, is really a consequence of 200 years of industrialization. And the carbon that's already in the atmosphere is a bigger problem than the carbon which will be added to the atmosphere. And the carbon that's in the atmosphere has been contributed largely by Western industrialized nations. Ergo, the cost of carbon neutrality must be borne by Japanese, Americans, Canadians, Germans, French, English. So then the ESG debate comes, because of the obvious validity of their argument, then the argument becomes, if the big thinkers want to impose carbon neutrality, they need to say to the citizens of the developed countries that have money, spend money, and sort of control the world, this is all coming out of your living standard. 100% of it's coming out of the living standard. And if you were honest, voters all across the Western world, which by the way they're beginning to do, would probably raise their middle finger to the big thinkers, to the people that fly 1,000 private jets to Davos to tell us to drive less. And I think this is just one example. I think that this part of the ESG discussion is becoming more popularly debated. And I think that's a very good thing. I think the outcome, well, the first outcome is that the sense that we're going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 is silly, completely silly, not going to happen. Whether or not it's desirable is another thing. But if we're going to get there, the idea that what we're going to do is legislate a bunch of stuff that's allegedly going to change things in the out years, except it isn't going to occur. And I don't think that the world is either willing to or frankly can afford to engage in a false debate of this order of magnitude. So I feel pretty comfortable about the beginning of the change of the discussion of ESG.
There's certainly been a lot of major issues that have affected people's lives, both all around the globe for the past half decade or so, that seem to be reaching proportions of ridiculousness. You mentioned silly, that's a good word for it, where it's like, I hope that there is a more frank and open discussion that reality, whether it's Mother Nature or whether it's poor outcomes of some of the sort of slapdash reactive approaches, policy lockdowns, all kinds of things that have happened in the last few years, and how those have played out. I hope that whether it's common sense, emerging up through the pain that people have felt at the hands of some of these big think imposed. It just reminds me of a lot of what happened in the 20th century. We had these utopian idealist dictatorships that basically had their way with, and anyway, tens to hundreds of millions of people died over that. And perhaps we're seeing now some of the promise that we hoped for, like with the internet giving more democratization of information or something within it. Seems that just got locked down too. But at least people are being able to talk about that fact, and that's being it's becoming exposed. The hand has been tipped enough that people are starting to see it for what it is. Your thoughts on that? Is that another glimmer of hopefulness that you have, that people will see the truth?
I absolutely think it's a cause for optimism. I recently joined the board of an organization called Students for Liberty, where I've been a contributor for many years. And believe me, a new board seat is something that I wanted less than COVID. But Students for Liberty is doing something important. They've taken 160,000 students, more than that now worldwide, and exposed them to libertarian ideas. There's nothing in the world that gives an old white guy like me hope as much as participating in a discussion group with young African kids in Goma with polysyllabic last names, where a 19-year-old Congolese female is lecturing me on the finer points of Hayek or Schumpeter or von Mises. 160,000 isn't very many when you look about 8 billion people in the world. On the other hand, when I was a student, there were probably 8 students worldwide that could spell libertarian, and I didn't happen to be one of them. And I'm seeing a remarkable resurgence in sanity among people. I'm not seeing that. And by the way, also, I'm seeing an increasing sense, at least in the groups that I hang out with, of all ages, of all races, a return of common sense, a return to the idea that society isn't responsible for your outcome, that you're responsible for your outcome, and that society's outcome is a function of hundreds of millions of people taking control of their own outcomes. And I'm really feeling, pretty optimistic about that. The idea that there's a guy and I'm not trying to say that the guy's a hero. There's some things about him that are wrong. But there's a guy who's a full-blown anarcho-capitalist who is the front runner in the presidential race for Argentina. I don't believe, if elected, that he will be able to dismantle the Argentine welfare state. I don't believe that he will be able to eliminate the Central Bank of Argentina. I don't believe that he will be able to reduce the size of Argentine government by 50% the first year and a second 50% the second year. What I do believe is that at least 42% of Argentines perceive a problem after 70 years of Peronism that is severe enough that they are willing to vote for a really radical reset. I don't think that the first effort, assuming that this guy is elected president, will be successful. But what I do see is that the perception of the problem is now widespread enough that we are beginning to have an open discussion in a country as strange as Argentina.
I'm heartened by your way of expressing that, and I think maybe we need to change the name from just Liberty and Finance to Liberty and Finance and Sanity, or Liberty and Finance and Common Sense, or something like that. Because looking back over, well, even Thomas Paine's Common Sense is starting to make a lot more sense in the current era. So anyway, there's a lot to be discussed. I really would appreciate us this time we fielded some more philosophical and broad topics than we usually do, and I'm grateful for that. We certainly are in dire need of return to common sense, and you've talked about the ascendancy of mankind. We can't have it be of the type where the emperor has no clothes on, and it just seems like everything's okay because everybody has to keep their mouth shut. But where we can actually be the people that we are, see what we see, know what we know, say what we need to say, and have that be the engine that drives our productivity and raises our standard of living together. So I think you've been cheering for that for a long, long time, and maybe the rest of us are just catching up, but we appreciate your presence here with us in doing that. And any boot camps coming up that we should let people know about?
We do have a royalty and streaming boot camp coming up due to senility. I don't remember the exact dates. But if you go to ruleclassroom.com or rulebootcamp.com, you can certainly sign up for that. We've had, as your audience will remember, Dunnigan, 3 highly successful boot camps in the past: uranium, silver, and electric and battery metals. These boot camps, for those of your audience who don't know, are 8 or 8.5 hour long online conferences about one topic. Very, very, very deep dives. More content, by the way, that you can absorb in 8 hours, but we make the transcripts available to any attendee for a 6-month period after the boot camp, which is very useful. The boot camps are $99 for attendees, gold-plated money-back guarantee. If you don't feel for any reason that you didn't get your money's worth, email me and I'll give you your money back. I would appreciate it if you tell me what I did wrong so that I can make the next boot camp more successful, but that's not a requirement. It's your money, not my money. So absolutely no financial risk. This one's about royalty and streaming. The royalty and streaming area is, I suspect, in many ways the safest of the investment options available to extractive industry investors, either mining investors and or oil and gas investors. And a primary on royalty and streaming is an absolute must, I think, for people who are establishing natural resource portfolios. Our keynote speaker will be Doug Silver. I was going to say an old friend, but a friend of long standing, going back 30 years. We are both old. Who maintained, as far as I know, the first royalty database in the world and was able to build a couple very successful royalty companies. This guy truly is a living legend. And he will take people through the background and the structure of the royalty and streaming business in a way that I think is as complete as WMC did with the uranium business. That introduction to the uranium business was worth the whole price of admission. So I look forward to any of your listeners who are interested in structuring natural resource investments and having them attend at my risk the Royalty and Streaming Bootcamp.
So folks, we'll make sure and put a link in the description of this video, not only to this, but Rick, I know we're keeping you over time, so we're going to let you go, but we'll also put a link to the offers that you've extended in the past for people to have their natural resource portfolios ranked, and the other ancillary offers that you associate with that. If those are still all standing, then we'll go ahead and put that in the description.
Absolutely, positively. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, Rick Rule, CEO of Rule Investment Media and RuleClassroom.com, I understand. Thank you for joining us again on Liberty and Finance.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we can let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Kaiser, my brother Elijah, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.